In the summer of 1924, the Wisconsin State Archives received a sealed wooden crate from the demolished ruins of what had once been the Mountain View Reformatory. Inside that crate lay documents so disturbing that they were immediately classified and locked away for over 50 years. The papers contained meticulous records of systematic medical experiments conducted on 78 inmates between 1871 and 1875. Experiments that violated every principle of human decency known to civilized society. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Each subject had been selected based on specific physical characteristics and psychological profiles, then subjected to procedures that left permanent physical and mental scarring. What made these experiments particularly horrifying was not just their brutal methodology, but the detailed photographs and clinical notes that documented each stage of human suffering with the cold precision of a scientist studying laboratory animals. The case was quietly buried when the reformatory's chief physician, Dr. Marcus Whitman, disappeared without explanation in March of 1875, leaving behind only a cryptic journal entry that read, "The boundaries between healing and harm have dissolved. What we have created here will haunt these walls forever. God forgive us all." The truth about Mountain View Reformatory remained hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic silence and destroyed records until one determined researcher refused to let the past stay buried. What the Wisconsin authorities had concealed wasn't merely evidence of medical malpractice, but proof of how far institutions would go to protect their reputations, even when it meant allowing systematic torture to continue unchecked in the name of scientific progress. Wisconsin in 1873 stood at the crossroads of American expansion and industrial growth. The state had emerged from the Civil War with its economy booming, its lumber mills feeding the reconstruction efforts across the South, and its agricultural output helping to feed a rapidly growing nation. Milwaukee had become a major industrial center, while smaller communities throughout the state prospered from the influx of German and Scandinavian immigrants seeking new opportunities in America's heartland. The rolling hills and dense forests of central Wisconsin provided the perfect setting for institutions designed to reform society's outcasts and misfits. Far from the prying eyes of urban reformers and newspaper reporters, these facilities could operate with minimal oversight and maximum autonomy. The isolation that made them ideal for rehabilitation also made them perfect for activities that would never survive public scrutiny. Steam locomotives carried passengers and freight across the state on newly constructed rail lines that connected even the most remote communities to the broader American economy. The whistle of train engines echoed across farmland and forest, carrying the sounds of progress and prosperity to every corner of Wisconsin. Telegraph lines followed the railroad tracks, bringing news and communication to previously isolated regions with unprecedented speed. Mountain View Reformatory had been established in 1869 as a progressive experiment in criminal rehabilitation, designed to house young men between the ages of 16 and 25, who had been convicted of various crimes, but were considered capable of reform through proper guidance and education. Unlike the harsh penitentiaries that dominated American corrections, Mountain View promised to combine discipline with education, work training with moral instruction. The facility occupied nearly 200 acres of wooded hills overlooking Lake Mendota, its imposing brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard that was supposed to foster a sense of community among the inmates. The architecture reflected the optimistic reformist thinking of the era, with large windows designed to bring natural light into the living spaces and workshops, where inmates learned trades that would help them reintegrate into society upon release. Dr. Marcus Whitman had been recruited from the prestigious Johns Hopkins Medical School to serve as the reformatory's chief physician and medical director. At 32, He represented the new generation of American doctors who had studied the latest European medical techniques and brought scientific rigor to the practice of medicine. His appointment was seen as evidence of Wisconsin's commitment to progressive rehabilitation methods. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Whitman possessed the kind of commanding presence that inspired confidence in both colleagues and patients. Tall and lean with prematurely gray hair that gave him an air of distinguished authority, he moved through the reformatory with the measured pace of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. His dark eyes held the intense focus of someone who saw every human interaction as an opportunity for scientific observation and analysis. The doctor had grown up in rural Vermont, the son of a country physician who had instilled in him both a deep respect for medical knowledge and a somewhat detached view of human suffering as simply another natural phenomenon to be studied and understood. His medical training at Johns Hopkins had reinforced this clinical approach, teaching him to view patients as collections of symptoms and systems, rather than as individual human beings with their own hopes and fears. Whitman lived in a comfortable house on the reformatory grounds, a two-story frame structure that had been built specifically for the chief physician and his family. Though he remained unmarried, preferring to dedicate his time entirely to his medical practice and research, the house provided him with space for a private laboratory, where he could conduct experiments that went far beyond the routine medical care expected of an institutional physician. The autumn of 1873 had been particularly harsh in central Wisconsin, with early snowfall covering the ground by the first week of October and temperatures dropping well below normal for the season. The reformatory's heating system, designed more for economy than comfort, struggled to maintain adequate warmth in the cell blocks and workshops, where inmates spent their days learning trades and receiving moral instruction. The cold weather created additional challenges for maintaining the health and morale of the inmate population, many of whom came from urban environments and were poorly prepared for the rigors of Wisconsin winters. Respiratory infections spread quickly through the dormitories, and minor injuries seemed to heal more slowly in the bitter cold that penetrated even the thickest stone walls. It was during this harsh winter that Dr. Whitman began to implement what he described in his journal as enhanced medical interventions, designed to study the limits of human adaptation and resilience. What he was actually conducting were systematic experiments on human subjects who had no ability to refuse participation and no understanding of what was being done to them. November 12, 1873. The scream that echoed through the medical wing of Mountain View Reformatory came from Thomas Mitchell, a 19-year-old inmate who had been serving a 2-year sentence for theft. Mitchell had been selected for what Dr. Whitman had described to the guards as advanced medical treatment for his chronic digestive problems, though the young man had never complained of any stomach ailments during his 8 months at the facility. The medical wing occupied the entire second floor of the reformatory's administration building, a series of interconnected rooms that included a small surgery, examination rooms, a pharmacy, and Dr. Whitman's private laboratory. Unlike the rest of the reformatory, these rooms were kept meticulously clean and organized, with the latest medical equipment arranged with the precision of a military inspection. Mitchell had been brought to the medical wing by 2 guards who told him only that the doctor wanted to see him for a routine examination. The young man, originally from Milwaukee's Irish immigrant community, had been arrested for stealing food to feed his younger siblings after their father's death in a factory accident left the family destitute. At the reformatory, Mitchell had proven to be a model inmate, attending classes regularly, learning carpentry skills in the workshop, and avoiding the fights and disciplinary problems that plagued many of his fellow prisoners. His good behavior had earned him the respect of the guards and the possibility of early release if he continued to demonstrate genuine reformation. Dr. Whitman's examination of Mitchell began routinely enough, with standard measurements of height, weight, and vital signs that were recorded in a leather-bound medical journal with the same careful precision that characterized all of the doctor's work. But as the examination continued, it became clear that Whitman was following procedures that had nothing to do with conventional medical practice. The doctor injected Mitchell with a clear fluid that he claimed was a preventive vaccine against tuberculosis, though no such vaccine existed in 1873, and tuberculosis prevention was accomplished through improved sanitation and nutrition rather than injections. Within minutes of receiving the injection, Mitchell began experiencing severe abdominal cramping and nausea that left him doubled over in pain. Rather than providing treatment for these obvious adverse reactions, Dr. Whitman carefully documented Mitchell's symptoms in his journal, noting the precise timing of each wave of pain and the physical manifestations of distress that appeared as the unknown substance spread through the young man's system. The clinical detachment with which he recorded human suffering revealed a mind that had crossed the line from medical treatment into systematic torture. The substance that Whitman had injected was later revealed to be a concentrated solution of various chemical compounds that he had been developing in his private laboratory, combinations of substances that had never been tested on humans and whose effects were completely unknown. His goal was to study the physiological responses to extreme stress and pain, using the inmates as unwilling test subjects for experiments that no legitimate medical institution would have permitted. Mitchell's ordeal continued for over 6 hours, during which time Dr. Whitman took detailed notes on every aspect of his subject's physical and psychological responses to the chemical injection. The young man's pleas for help were ignored, his cries of pain treated as simply more data to be recorded in the ever-growing collection of experimental observations. When the effects of the injection finally subsided, Mitchell was returned to his cell with instructions to the guards that he was recovering from a minor surgical procedure and should be monitored for any changes in his condition. The young man himself was warned that discussing his experience in the medical wing with other inmates would result in immediate placement in solitary confinement and the loss of all privileges he had earned through good behavior. What Mitchell couldn't know was that his experience represented just the beginning of Dr. Whitman's systematic program of human experimentation, a program that would eventually claim 78 victims over the course of nearly 2 years. Each experiment was designed to test the limits of human endurance and the physiological responses to various forms of chemical and physical stress. The selection process for experimental subjects followed criteria that Whitman had developed. Based on his study of European medical literature and his own theories about the relationship between criminal behavior and physical characteristics, he believed that certain types of criminals possessed enhanced resistance to pain and stress that made them ideal subjects for research that would benefit broader medical knowledge. Inmates were chosen based on their age, physical condition, criminal history, and behavioral patterns within the reformatory. Those who showed signs of intelligence or leadership ability were specifically targeted, as Whitman theorized that their psychological responses would provide more valuable data than those of subjects he considered mentally inferior. The experiments themselves varied widely in their methodology and objectives, though all shared the common characteristic of causing deliberate harm to unwilling subjects in the name of scientific advancement. Some involved the injection of unknown chemical compounds, while others tested the effects of extreme temperatures, sleep deprivation, or surgical procedures performed without proper anesthesia. Dr. Whitman's laboratory journals, discovered decades later among the sealed documents, revealed the systematic nature of his research program and the cold scientific methodology he applied to human torture. Each experiment was carefully planned and documented, with detailed observations recorded about every aspect of the subject's responses to various forms of induced trauma. The medical equipment found in Whitman's laboratory included devices that had no legitimate medical purpose. instruments designed specifically for causing controlled amounts of pain and injury, while keeping subjects conscious and able to respond to questioning. These tools represented a perverse application of medical knowledge, healing arts twisted into instruments of deliberate harm. As winter deepened and the reformatory became increasingly isolated by snow and bitter cold, Dr. Whitman's experiments grew more extreme and dangerous. The remote location of the facility and the complete authority he wielded over the medical care of inmates created the perfect conditions for systematic abuse that could continue without outside interference or oversight. The guards and other staff members at Mountain View were either unaware of the true nature of what was happening in the medical wing or had been convinced that the experiments represented legitimate medical research that would ultimately benefit society. Whitman's reputation as a distinguished physician and his connection to prestigious medical institutions gave his work an aura of scientific respectability that discouraged questions or challenges to his methods. The isolation that had made Mountain View Reformatory an ideal location for progressive rehabilitation programs also made it the perfect setting for activities that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Far from the oversight of medical boards, government inspectors, or reform-minded citizens, Dr. Whitman was free to pursue his twisted vision of scientific advancement through systematic human experimentation. The first victim of what would become known as the Mountain View medical experiments had been chosen not for any medical condition he possessed, but because he represented the type of subject that Dr. Whitman believed would provide the most valuable scientific data. Thomas Mitchell's ordeal marked the beginning of a program of systematic torture that would continue for nearly 2 years, claiming 78 victims and leaving scars that would never fully heal. The autumn wind that howled through the hills surrounding Mountain View Reformatory carried with it the promise of a brutal winter ahead. But for the inmates selected for Dr. Whitman's experiments, the cold weather outside would prove to be far less dangerous than the clinical cruelty that awaited them in the medical wing's sterile examination rooms. The wooden buildings of Mountain View Reformatory stood like silent sentinels against the harsh Wisconsin landscape, their red brick facades weathered by countless seasons of bitter cold and oppressive summer heat. Within these walls, nearly 300 young men served sentences ranging from 18 months to 5 years, most believing they had been sent to an institution dedicated to their rehabilitation and eventual return to productive society. The daily routine at Mountain View followed a strict schedule designed to instill discipline and work habits in men who had previously lived chaotic lives on the streets of Milwaukee, Madison, and other Wisconsin cities. Wake-up came at 5:30. Each morning with the clanging of a massive bell that echoed through every corner of the facility, followed by mandatory calisthenics in the central courtyard, regardless of weather conditions. Breakfast consisted of weak coffee, porridge made from cornmeal, and occasional portions of salt pork that provided barely enough nutrition to sustain men engaged in hard physical labor throughout the day. The dining hall buzzed with quiet conversation as inmates discussed work assignments, shared news from letters received from family members, and speculated about release dates that seemed impossibly distant. Work assignments began at 7 o'clock sharp and continued until 6 in the evening, with only a brief break for the midday meal. The reformatory operated several workshops where inmates learned carpentry, blacksmithing, tailoring, and other trades that would supposedly help them find honest employment upon release. The products of their labor were sold to businesses throughout Wisconsin, providing revenue that helped fund the institution's operations. Captain Henry Morrison served as the reformatory's warden, a position he had accepted after 20 years of military service that included action in several major battles of the Civil War. Morrison genuinely believed in the reformatory's mission of rehabilitation through discipline and education, though his military background led him to view the inmates more as soldiers to be trained than as individuals deserving of compassion and understanding. The warden's office occupied a corner room on the first floor of the administration building, its windows providing a clear view of the central courtyard, where inmates gathered for meals, exercise, and the occasional educational lecture. Morrison kept his office spartanly furnished, with only a simple wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf containing military manuals and administrative documents related to prison management. Morrison's relationship with Dr. Whitman was cordial, but distant, reflecting the natural tension between administrative authority and medical expertise that existed in most institutional settings. The warden respected Whitman's medical credentials and generally deferred to his judgment regarding the health care of inmates, though he occasionally questioned the frequency with which certain inmates were called to the medical wing for examinations and treatments. The reformatory's guard force consisted of 12 men who worked in rotating shifts to maintain security and supervise inmate activities throughout the facility. Most were local residents who had taken the job because it provided steady employment and a modest salary, though few had any training in dealing with the psychological challenges of managing men who had been separated from their families and communities. Among the guards, Sergeant William Hartley stood out for his genuine concern for the welfare of the inmates under his supervision. A former school teacher who had taken the guard position after the local school board eliminated his teaching job. Due to budget constraints, Hartley brought an educational perspective to his work that often put him at odds with colleagues who favored more punitive approaches to inmate management. Hartley had begun to notice patterns in Dr. Whitman's selection of inmates for medical treatment that troubled him deeply. The men chosen for extended stays in the medical wing were invariably among the most intelligent and well-behaved prisoners, those who had demonstrated genuine commitment to rehabilitation and showed promise for successful reintegration into society upon release. The guard's suspicions were first aroused when Thomas Mitchell failed to return to his regular work assignment in the carpentry shop after what Dr. Whitman had described as a routine medical examination. When Hartley inquired about Mitchell's absence, he was told that the young man was recovering from a minor surgical procedure and would return to normal duties within a few days. However, when Mitchell finally did return to the workshop, his behavior had changed dramatically from the cheerful, hard-working attitude that had previously characterized his approach to his sentence. The young man appeared withdrawn and fearful, jumping at unexpected sounds and avoiding eye contact with both guards and fellow inmates. Hartley's attempts to engage Mitchell in conversation were met with monosyllabic responses and nervous glances toward the administration building where the medical wing was located. The change in the young man's demeanor was so pronounced that other inmates began to comment on it, speculating quietly about what might have happened during his time in the doctor's care. The guard's concerns deepened when he observed similar changes in other inmates who had spent time in the medical wing. Men who had previously been outgoing and engaged in reformatory activities became sullen and withdrawn, often displaying physical symptoms that suggested they were experiencing ongoing pain or discomfort that they were reluctant to discuss. Dr. Whitman's medical journals, kept with meticulous attention to detail, documented the progression of his experimental program as he refined his techniques and expanded the scope of his research. Each entry was written in the clinical language of scientific observation, describing human suffering with the same detached precision that a botanist might use to catalog the effects of various chemicals on plant specimens. The experiments conducted during the winter months of 1873 and 1874 focused primarily on testing the effects of various chemical compounds on human physiology and psychology. Whitman had developed a series of injections that produced different types of physical and mental distress, allowing him to study the relationships between chemical stimulation and human response patterns. One series of experiments involved the injection of substances that cause severe muscle spasms and convulsions, while another focused on compounds that induced hallucinations and psychological disorientation. The doctor carefully documented the duration and intensity of each reaction, noting individual variations in response and developing theories about the factors that influenced susceptibility to different types of chemical manipulation. The most disturbing aspect of these experiments was not their physical effects, though these were often severe and long-lasting, but the psychological impact they had on subjects who were forced to endure experiences that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality and bodily autonomy. Many of the men selected for Whitman's research never fully recovered from the trauma of being used as human laboratory specimens. The selection process for experimental subjects became more systematic as Dr. Whitman refined his research methodology and developed clearer criteria for choosing inmates who would provide the most valuable scientific data. He began maintaining detailed files on every prisoner at Mountain View, documenting their physical characteristics, medical history, psychological profile, and behavioral patterns within the institutional setting. Inmates who demonstrated high intelligence were particularly prized as experimental subjects because Whitman believed their more sophisticated nervous systems would produce more complex and interesting responses to chemical manipulation. Men who had shown leadership abilities among their fellow prisoners were also targeted, as the doctor theorized that their psychological resilience would allow them to survive more extreme experimental procedures. The medical wing's examination. Rooms were gradually transformed into sophisticated laboratories, equipped with instruments designed specifically for conducting experiments on unwilling human subjects. Restraining devices were installed to prevent subjects from injuring themselves during periods of chemically induced convulsions, while monitoring equipment allowed Whitman to track vital signs and other physiological responses throughout each experimental session. The doctor's private laboratory became the center of his research activities, a room filled with glass containers holding various chemical compounds, heating apparatus for preparing experimental solutions, and detailed charts documenting the effects of different substances on human subjects. The laboratory's locked cabinets contained substances that had never been tested on humans and whose effects were completely unknown to medical science. As winter gave way to spring in 1874, Dr. Whitman's experiments grew more ambitious and dangerous. The relative success of his initial chemical trials had convinced him that he was on the verge of major scientific breakthroughs that would revolutionize medical understanding of human physiology and psychology. His journal entries from this period reveal a man increasingly disconnected from normal ethical considerations and human empathy. The isolation of Mountain View Reformatory continued to provide perfect cover for activities that would never have been tolerated in institutions subject to regular outside inspection and oversight. The facility's remote location and the complete authority wielded by Dr. Whitman over medical decisions created conditions where systematic abuse could continue indefinitely without detection. The changing seasons brought new challenges for maintaining the experimental program, as increased daylight hours and warmer weather made it more difficult to conduct lengthy procedures without attracting attention from other staff members and inmates. Whitman responded by scheduling most of his experiments during night hours when the reformatory was quieter and fewer people were moving through the administration building. The psychological impact of the experimental program extended far beyond the men who were directly subjected to Whitman's procedures. The entire inmate population gradually became aware that something unusual was happening in the medical wing, though few understood the true nature of the activities being conducted there. Fear spread through the dormitories as men who had been selected for medical treatment returned, changed in ways that suggested they had experienced trauma far beyond anything associated with legitimate medical care. The atmosphere of uncertainty and dread that pervaded the reformatory made rehabilitation efforts increasingly difficult as inmates became more focused on avoiding the doctor's attention than on participating in educational and work programs. The reformatory's workshop production began to decline as men became distracted by fears about medical examinations and treatments that seemed to follow no logical medical pattern. The carpentry shop, blacksmith forge, and tailoring operation all reported decreased output as workers struggled to concentrate on their tasks while worrying about being called to the medical wing. Guard Sergeant Hartley's observations of these changes led him to begin keeping his own informal records of inmates who had spent time in Dr. Whitman's care. The patterns he documented revealed a systematic program of selecting the reformatory's most promising inmates for experiences that left them psychologically damaged and physically impaired. The spring of 1874 marked a turning point in Dr. Whitman's experimental program as he began to implement procedures that went far beyond chemical injections to include surgical interventions designed to test the limits of human pain tolerance and recovery capacity. These operations were performed without proper anesthesia and often involved deliberate injury to healthy tissue for the sole purpose of studying healing processes and pain responses. The medical equipment in Whitman's examination rooms was supplemented with surgical instruments that had been modified for experimental rather than therapeutic purposes. Scalpels, forceps, and other tools were used to inflict controlled injuries that could be studied and documented as they healed, providing data about human recovery mechanisms under various conditions of stress and deprivation. The screams that began to echo from the medical wing during these surgical experiments could be heard throughout the administration building and into the adjacent dormitories where inmates lay awake at night, wondering which of them would be selected next for Dr. Whitman's increasingly extreme research procedures. The disappearance of Samuel Richardson marked the beginning of a new and more sinister phase in Dr. Whitman's experimental program. Richardson, a 23-year-old inmate serving time for burglary, had been called to the medical wing on a Tuesday morning in May 1874 and simply never returned to his cell or work assignment in the blacksmith shop. When other inmates inquired about Richardson's whereabouts, they were told by guards that he had been transferred to another facility for specialized medical treatment. However, no official transfer documents were ever filed, and Richardson's name disappeared entirely from the reformatory's records, as if he had never existed at all. Sergeant Hartley's growing suspicions about Dr. Whitman's activities were fueled by the mysterious circumstances surrounding Richardson's disappearance. The guard had observed the young man being escorted to the medical wing by 2 orderlies, but unlike previous inmates who had undergone treatment, Richardson was never seen again in any part of the reformatory. The blacksmith shop foreman, a civilian employee named Edward Collins, who supervised inmate workers in the metalworking trades, reported Richardson's absence to Warden Morrison with obvious concern for the young man's welfare. Richardson had been one of the most skilled workers in the shop, demonstrating natural talent for metalworking that made him valuable to the reformatory's production operations. Collins had developed a genuine fondness for Richardson, who reminded him of his own son serving in the cavalry on the western frontier. The young inmate had shown remarkable aptitude for learning complex metalworking techniques and had expressed hopes of finding employment as a blacksmith upon his release from the reformatory. When Collins pressed Warden Morrison for information about Richardson's transfer, he was given vague explanations about medical complications that required treatment at a specialized facility in Milwaukee. However, when Collins later made discreet inquiries with contacts at medical facilities throughout Wisconsin, he could find no record of Richardson being admitted anywhere for treatment. The mysterious disappearance created an atmosphere of increased tension and fear among the inmate population, as men began to realize that being selected for medical treatment might involve more serious consequences than anyone had previously imagined. Conversations in the dormitories increasingly focused on ways to avoid attracting Dr. Whitman's attention and speculation about what had really happened to inmates who had vanished from the reformatory. Dr. Whitman's journal entries from this period reveal a man who had completely abandoned any pretense of conducting legitimate medical research and had embraced a program of systematic, human experimentation that recognized no ethical boundaries or moral constraints. His writing displays the cold, analytical tone of a scientist studying laboratory specimens rather than treating human patients. The doctor had constructed a specialized examination room in the basement of the medical wing, a space that was soundproofed and equipped with restraining devices, monitoring equipment, and surgical instruments, designed specifically for conducting experiments that would never be permitted in any legitimate medical setting. This hidden laboratory became the site of procedures so extreme that even Whitman realized they could never be discovered by reformatory officials or outside authorities. The basement laboratory represented the culmination of months of preparation and planning, equipped with everything necessary for conducting long-term experiments on unwilling human subjects. The room contained multiple examination tables with leather restraints, cabinets filled with experimental chemicals and surgical instruments, and detailed charts documenting the physiological responses of previous test subjects. Access to the basement laboratory was restricted to Dr. Whitman and two orderlies who had been carefully selected for their willingness to follow orders without question and their complete discretion regarding the activities they witnessed. These men were paid substantially more than other reformatory employees and were bound by written agreements that prohibited them from discussing their work with anyone outside the medical wing. The orderlies Frank Mueller and James Patterson were both men with troubled backgrounds who had found employment at the reformatory after struggling to find work elsewhere due to their criminal histories. Mueller had served time for assault and battery before being hired as a medical orderly, while Patterson had been arrested multiple times for public intoxication and vagrancy. Both men understood that their continued employment depended entirely on their complete loyalty to Dr. Whitman and their willingness to participate in activities that went far beyond normal medical duties. The generous wages they received and the housing provided on the reformatory grounds gave them incentives to maintain absolute silence about what they witnessed in the basement laboratory. The procedures conducted in the hidden laboratory represented a systematic program of human experimentation that tested the limits of pain tolerance, psychological endurance, and physical recovery under extreme conditions. Subjects were restrained and subjected to various forms of chemical, thermal, and surgical trauma while their responses were carefully monitored and documented. One series of experiments involved the injection of caustic substances directly into muscle tissue to study inflammation and tissue damage, while another focused on the effects of extreme temperature changes on circulation and nerve function. The most disturbing procedures involved surgical operations performed without anesthesia to study pain responses and the relationship between physical trauma and psychological breakdown. Dr. Whitman's theoretical framework for these experiments was based on his belief that criminal behavior resulted from physiological abnormalities that could be studied and potentially corrected through medical intervention. He viewed the inmates as ideal test subjects because their criminal histories suggested they possessed different pain thresholds and psychological characteristics than normal citizens. The doctor's journal entries reveal his conviction that the suffering he was inflicting on experimental subjects was justified by the potential medical knowledge that might result from his research. He wrote extensively about the importance of pushing beyond conventional ethical boundaries in the pursuit of scientific advancement, arguing that true medical progress required experimentation that most physicians were too squeamish to undertake. As summer approached and the reformatory's daily routines shifted to accommodate longer daylight hours and warmer weather, Dr. Whitman's selection of experimental subjects became more frequent and systematic. Men were called to the medical wing on an almost daily basis, though only some returned to their regular duties, while others simply disappeared without explanation. The pattern of disappearances began to create serious operational problems for the reformatory as skilled workers vanished from the workshops and experienced inmates, who had served as informal leaders among their fellow prisoners, were removed from the general population. The carpentry shop, blacksmith forge, and other production facilities struggled to maintain output as their most capable workers were systematically eliminated. Warden Morrison found himself caught between his administrative responsibilities and his growing concerns about the medical program under Dr. Whitman's direction. The warden had received complaints from civilian supervisors about the loss of skilled inmate workers, but when he raised these concerns with Whitman, he was assured that the medical treatments were necessary for the health and safety of the entire reformatory population. The doctor's explanations to Morrison relied heavily on medical terminology and scientific concepts that the former military officer did not fully understand. Whitman spoke convincingly about preventing the spread of contagious diseases, conducting research that would benefit future inmates, and maintaining the highest standards of medical care that befitted a progressive rehabilitation facility. Morrison's military background had trained him to respect expertise in areas outside his own knowledge, and he was reluctant to interfere with medical decisions made by a physician with credentials from prestigious institutions. The warden's faith in institutional authority and proper chains of command made him an unwitting accomplice in the systematic abuse being conducted under his administrative oversight. The reformatory's monthly reports to state authorities in Madison began to reflect the growing problems caused by the medical experimentation program, though these issues were attributed to various administrative challenges rather than any systematic problems with inmate care. Production figures declined, disciplinary incidents increased, and requests for inmate transfers to other facilities became more frequent. State officials reviewing these reports attributed the reformatory's difficulties to the normal challenges of managing young offenders and the seasonal variations that affected all correctional institutions. The remote location of Mountain View and the general reluctance of government bureaucrats to conduct detailed inspections of correctional facilities meant that serious problems could continue indefinitely without detection. Dr. Whitman's confidence in his ability to continue his experimental program without interference was reinforced by the lack of serious oversight from state authorities and the deference shown to his medical expertise by reformatory staff. He began planning even more extreme experiments that would test the absolute limits of human endurance and provide data that he believed would revolutionize medical understanding of pain, trauma, and recovery. The summer of 1874 saw the implementation of procedures so extreme that even the carefully selected orderlies who assisted Whitman began to express private concerns about the direction of the research program. Mueller and Patterson had witnessed procedures that challenged their ability to maintain the emotional detachment necessary for their continued participation in the experimental program. The basement laboratory became the site of activities that defied description in conventional medical or scientific terms. Procedures designed not to heal or help, but to explore the darkest possibilities of human manipulation and control. Subjects were kept in the hidden facility for days or weeks at a time, subjected to continuous cycles of trauma and recovery that provided ongoing data about human resilience and breakdown. The soundproofing that had been installed in the basement laboratory ensured that the screams and pleas of experimental subjects could not be heard by other reformatory staff or inmates, creating a space where human suffering could continue indefinitely without risk of discovery. The isolation of the laboratory from the rest of the facility meant that Dr. Whitman could pursue his research without concern for institutional policies or ethical constraints. As autumn approached and the number of missing inmates continued to grow, Sergeant Hartley made the decision that would ultimately expose the horrors being perpetrated in the basement of the Mountain View Reformatory Medical Wing. The guards' detailed observations and informal record-keeping had documented a pattern of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored or explained away as legitimate medical treatment. Sergeant Hartley's clandestine investigation began on a cold October evening when he decided to conduct an unauthorized inspection of the medical wing after observing Dr. Whitman and his orderlies working unusually late hours for several consecutive nights. The guard had noticed lights burning in the administration building well past midnight and had heard strange mechanical sounds coming from the direction of the medical facilities. Armed with a skeleton key that provided access to most areas of the reformatory, Hartley waited until the night shift guards were making their rounds in the distant cell blocks before entering the administration building through a side entrance that was rarely used during evening hours. The building's corridors were dimly lit by widely spaced gas fixtures that created pools of yellow light separated by long stretches of shadow. The medical wing appeared deserted when Hartley reached the second floor, with all examination rooms dark and apparently unoccupied. However, as he moved carefully through the area, he detected a faint chemical odor that seemed to emanate from somewhere below the main medical facilities. The smell was unlike anything associated with normal medical practice, a harsh combination of disinfectants and other substances that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. Following the source of the odor led Hartley to a staircase he had never noticed before, hidden behind a door marked with a simple sign reading, "Storage Authorized Personnel Only." The wooden steps descended into darkness, and the chemical smell grew stronger with each step downward. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, allowing thin beams of electric light to escape into the corridor. The basement laboratory that Hartley discovered through that doorway defied every assumption he had made about the nature of medical care at Mountain View Reformatory. The room was brightly lit by electric fixtures powered by a private generator, and contained equipment that bore no resemblance to anything found in legitimate medical facilities throughout Wisconsin. Multiple examination tables equipped with leather restraints occupied the center of the laboratory, while the walls were lined with cabinets containing glass containers filled with various colored liquids and chemical compounds. Surgical instruments lay arranged on metal trays, many showing modifications that suggested they had been adapted for purposes other than healing. Charts and diagrams covered one entire wall, documenting human anatomy with particular attention to pain receptors and nerve pathways. Most disturbing of all were the detailed photographs pinned to a bulletin board near Dr. Whitman's desk, images that documented the progressive effects of various experimental procedures on human subjects. The photographs showed men in various stages of physical and psychological distress, their faces contorted with pain and terror as they endured procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics. Hartley recognized several of the men in the photographs as inmates who had disappeared from the reformatory over the past months, including Samuel Richardson, whose fate had remained a mystery since his disappearance in May. The images provided clear evidence that these men had not been transferred to other facilities, as officials had claimed, but had instead become unwilling subjects in Dr. Whitman's systematic program of human experimentation. The guard's hands trembled as he examined a thick leather journal that lay open on Whitman's desk, its pages filled with clinical observations written in the doctor's precise handwriting. Each entry documented a different experimental procedure, recording the subject's responses to various forms of chemical, thermal, and surgical trauma with the detached precision of a scientist studying laboratory animals. One entry dated just 3 days earlier described in clinical detail the effects of injecting acid directly into the spinal column of a subject identified only as Subject 71. The observations noted the duration and intensity of the subject's screams, the physical convulsions that resulted from nerve damage, and the eventual loss of motor function in the lower extremities. The entry concluded with plans for follow-up procedures to test the subject's pain responses after permanent paralysis had been achieved. Another section of the journal documented experiments involving deliberate exposure to extreme temperatures, describing how subjects were alternately subjected to scalding water and freezing cold to study the body's adaptive responses to thermal trauma. The clinical language used to describe human suffering revealed a mind that had completely abandoned any sense of empathy or moral constraint in pursuit of what Whitman considered scientific knowledge. The laboratory contained evidence of experiments that went beyond individual torture to include studies of group psychology and social dynamics among experimental subjects. One area of the basement had been converted into a series of small cells where multiple subjects were housed together and subjected to various forms of psychological manipulation designed to study human behavior under extreme stress. Hartley discovered detailed records of these group experiments, which involved creating artificial conflicts between subjects, manipulating food and water supplies to create competition and desperation, and introducing various stressors to observe how social relationships deteriorated under pressure. The observations documented how quickly civilized behavior collapsed when men were placed in desperate circumstances with no hope of rescue or relief. The photographic evidence included images of subjects who had been deliberately infected with various diseases to study the progression of illness and the effects of different treatments on immune system function. Some photographs showed men covered with lesions and rashes that resulted from experimental chemicals applied to their skin, while others documented the effects of surgical procedures performed without anesthesia or proper sterile technique. As Hartley continued his investigation of the laboratory, he heard footsteps on the stairs leading down from the medical wing above. The approaching voices belonged to Dr. Whitman and his orderlies, returning from what sounded like a dinner break to resume their evening's work. The guard quickly gathered several pages from the journal and a handful of photographs before hiding behind a bank of chemical storage cabinets as the three men entered the laboratory. From his concealed position, Hartley witnessed preparations for an experimental procedure that provided horrifying insight into the systematic nature of Dr. Whitman's research program. The orderlies wheeled in a metal gurney carrying an unconscious inmate whom Hartley recognized as David Peterson, a 19-year-old serving time for horse theft, who had been called to the medical wing earlier that day for what was described as a routine physical examination. Peterson had been one of the most popular inmates at the reformatory, known for his quick wit and generous nature despite his criminal conviction. He regularly shared food packages from his family with inmates who received no outside support, and had organized informal educational classes where more literate inmates taught reading and writing to their fellow prisoners. Dr. Whitman's preparations for the evening's experiment involved injecting Peterson with a substance that kept him unconscious but responsive to pain stimuli, allowing the doctor to conduct procedures that would cause extreme suffering while maintaining the subject's vital signs and physiological responses. The clinical efficiency with which these preparations were made revealed years of practice and refinement of techniques designed to maximize both pain and scientific observation. The procedure that Hartley witnessed from his hiding place involved systematic nerve stimulation using electrical current, applied through metal probes inserted into various parts of Peterson's body. Dr. Whitman carefully documented each response, noting the precise voltage required to elicit different types of physical reactions and the duration of various types of muscle contractions and spasms. The orderlies assisted with mechanical precision, adjusting equipment and recording observations as directed by Dr. Whitman without showing any sign of emotional response to the suffering they were helping to inflict. Their complete detachment from the humanity of their victim revealed the extent to which they had been conditioned to view experimental subjects as nothing more than laboratory specimens. Throughout the 3-hour procedure, Dr. Whitman maintained a running commentary that revealed his theoretical framework for the experiments and his plans for future research activities. He spoke of mapping the complete human nervous system through systematic stimulation of every nerve pathway, creating detailed charts of pain responses that would advance medical understanding by decades. The doctor's monologue revealed his belief that conventional medical research was hampered by ethical constraints that prevented the kind of thorough investigation necessary for true scientific advancement. He argued that his work at Mountain View represented the future of medical research, freed from the sentimental concerns that limited progress in university and hospital settings. As the procedure continued, Peterson occasionally regained enough consciousness to moan or cry out, though the chemical compounds in his system prevented him from fully awakening or understanding what was being done to him. These moments of semi-consciousness seemed to particularly interest Dr. Whitman, who viewed them as opportunities to study the relationship between awareness and pain perception. The experimental session concluded with Peterson being returned to a holding cell in the basement laboratory rather than to his regular dormitory quarters. Dr. Whitman explained to his orderlies that the subject would be kept in isolation for several days to monitor his recovery, and planned follow-up procedures that would test the permanent effects of nerve damage on motor function and pain sensitivity. Hartley remained hidden behind the chemical storage cabinets for nearly an hour after Dr. Whitman and his orderlies left the laboratory, ensuring that they would not return unexpectedly while he completed his investigation. The additional time allowed him to gather more evidence from the laboratory, including detailed chemical formulas and experimental protocols that documented the systematic nature of the research program. The guard's discovery of a detailed roster containing the names of 78 inmates who had been used as experimental subjects over the past 2 years provided the final piece of evidence needed to expose the full scope of Dr. Whitman's activities. The roster included notes about each subject's physical characteristics, experimental procedures performed, and final disposition, with many entries simply marked deceased, disposed. The systematic record-keeping revealed that Dr. Whitman's experimental program had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined, involving nearly a quarter of the reformatory's total inmate population over a 2-year period. The clinical documentation of human suffering and death represented a level of systematic cruelty that challenged comprehension, even for a man who had spent years working in correctional facilities. As Hartley prepared to leave the basement laboratory, with the evidence he had gathered, he heard sounds coming from the holding cells where experimental subjects were kept between procedures. The weak calls for help and water came from men who had been forgotten by the outside world and abandoned to serve as human laboratory specimens in Dr. Whitman's pursuit of scientific knowledge. The confrontation between Sergeant Hartley and Dr. Whitman took place at dawn on October 15, 1874, when the guard arrived at the reformatory with federal marshals and a team of medical investigators from the Wisconsin State Medical Board. Hartley had spent the entire night traveling to Madison to deliver his evidence to state authorities, who immediately dispatched investigators to Mountain View, upon reviewing the photographs and journal entries he had gathered from the basement laboratory. Dr. Whitman was found in his private laboratory, calmly preparing for another experimental session with David Peterson, who had been kept in the basement holding cells for 3 days following the electrical nerve stimulation procedure. The doctor showed no surprise or concern when the investigators entered his laboratory, instead expressing annoyance that his work was being interrupted by people who lacked the scientific background to understand the importance of his research. The federal marshals discovered 17 inmates confined in the basement holding cells, all showing evidence of recent experimental procedures that had left them with various physical injuries and psychological trauma. Many were barely conscious due to the chemical compounds that had been administered to keep them docile during transportation and experimentation. The condition of these men provided immediate evidence of the systematic abuse that had been conducted under the guise of medical treatment. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Dr. Whitman's experimental program and the network of complicity that had allowed it to continue undetected for nearly 2 years. Warden Morrison was arrested as an accessory after investigators discovered correspondence showing that he had been aware of irregularities in the medical program, but had chosen to ignore them due to his respect for Whitman's medical credentials. and his reluctance to interfere with activities he did not fully understand. The orderlies Frank Mueller and James Patterson were taken into custody and provided detailed testimony about their role in the experimental procedures in exchange for reduced charges. Their accounts revealed the systematic nature of the research program and the careful planning that had gone into creating a facility where human experimentation could be conducted without detection or interference from outside authorities. The basement laboratory was sealed and its contents cataloged by medical investigators who documented hundreds of experimental protocols, chemical formulas, and photographic records that provided evidence of crimes against humanity that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. The systematic documentation of human suffering revealed a level of scientific cruelty that challenged contemporary understanding of medical ethics and professional responsibility. The trial of Dr. Marcus Whitman became one of the most significant legal proceedings in Wisconsin history, establishing precedents for prosecuting medical professionals who abused their authority and violated the trust placed in them by patients and institutions. The proceedings lasted for 6 weeks and featured testimony from surviving experimental subjects, reformatory staff members, and medical experts who explained the nature of the procedures that had been conducted. Whitman's defense relied on claims that his research represented legitimate, scientific inquiry that would ultimately benefit medical knowledge and human understanding of physiology and psychology. His attorneys argued that the inmates had been willing participants in research that was similar to studies being conducted at universities and medical schools throughout the United States and Europe. However, the evidence presented by prosecutors painted a clear picture of systematic torture conducted under the pretense of medical research, with subjects who had no ability to consent to participation and no understanding of what was being done to them. The photographic evidence and detailed journal entries provided undeniable proof of deliberate cruelty that went far beyond any legitimate scientific purpose. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty. Verdicts on all charges, including murder, assault, and conducting illegal medical experiments on unwilling subjects. Dr. Whitman was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Wisconsin State Penitentiary, where he died of natural causes in 1891 while serving his sentence. The Mountain View Reformatory was permanently closed following the investigation, with surviving inmates transferred to other facilities throughout Wisconsin. The buildings were demolished in 1876, and the land was sold to private developers who had no knowledge of the activities that had been conducted there. The site eventually became a residential development where families built homes over the ground, where systematic human experimentation had once taken place. The case led to significant reforms in medical regulation and oversight of institutional healthcare throughout Wisconsin and other states. New laws required regular inspections of medical facilities, mandatory reporting of experimental procedures, and strict penalties for medical professionals who violated ethical standards in their treatment of patients. Sergeant William Hartley was promoted to the position of Chief Investigator for the Wisconsin Department of Corrections and spent the remainder of his career developing protocols for detecting and preventing institutional abuse. His methods for recognizing patterns of systematic mistreatment became standard training for corrections officers and medical inspectors throughout the United States. The 78 men who served as experimental subjects in Dr. Whitman's research program were never forgotten, though many of their identities remained unknown due to the destruction of official records and the deliberate efforts to conceal the scope of the experimental activities. A memorial was erected in Madison, listing the names of known victims and acknowledging the suffering of those whose identities could not be determined. The legacy of the Mountain View experiments served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the potential for respected institutions to become sites of systematic abuse when proper oversight and accountability mechanisms are absent. The case demonstrated how easily scientific progress could be perverted into justification for unconscionable cruelty when ethical constraints were abandoned in pursuit of knowledge. The story of Mountain View Reformatory continues to resonate as a reminder that the most dangerous individuals are often those who possess the education, authority, and institutional protection necessary to conduct systematic abuse while maintaining the appearance of legitimate professional activity. The systematic documentation of human suffering revealed a mind that had completely abandoned moral considerations in favor of what it considered scientific advancement. The Wisconsin State Archives maintain sealed records related to the Mountain View case with access restricted to qualified researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic or legal purposes for reviewing the materials. The detailed evidence of systematic human experimentation continues to serve as a resource for understanding how institutional authority can be abused and how such abuse can be detected and prevented. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.